Hi, welcome to today's video. I'm Michael Neuenschwander with Outlook Wealth Advisors, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about AI, and specifically, can ChatGPT pick a portfolio for you? So I'll share with you the experiment that we did, the results, and some of the things you need to consider when you're thinking about having AI or other services simply do the picking or creating a portfolio for you. So first, let me share with you the experiment. What I put into ChatGPT was simply create a portfolio of ETFs that have had an average return of better than 10% over the last 10 years, but along the way have not ever lost more than 10%. Now, being that we focus on planning for retirement and people close to retirement, we're not trying to say, shoot for the highest return at any cost. We're trying to say, can we have a good return, but not get burned or get hurt too bad along the way? Now, our goals may be different than yours, but that's where we started, for today's video. So as we put that in, and we went through a couple iterations to try to refine it, ultimately what we got back out, however, was simply a listing of rather generic, ETFs. So large cap growth, large cap value, some commodities, a little bit of small cap, mid cap, and some international. Now, here's the test that we're able to do that maybe a lot of people or a lot of consumers aren't able to do directly, or at least didn't know they should check. So as we got that answer, I could look at the funds, a collection of whether it was Vanguard or Fidelity, various ETFs, and say, okay, the good funds, but did it meet the criteria? So we took those funds, the allocation it gave, and went back into our software that allows us to look and say, what's the actual return of those funds over the last, 1, 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Unfortunately, the result is not at all what we asked for, meaning when we looked at that allocation, even whether we replied, rebalancing, annually, quarterly, we tried different scenarios, said, ultimately, the result, though, of what ChatGPT gave us was that the portfolio did average about 9%. So again, not too bad. Not 10, but 9% is pretty close. However, here's where it really missed. When we went back and tested and said whether that was back through the pandemic, whether it was through, the drop we had right around all the tariff announcements, whether it was through 2022 when the market dropped because of fears about interest rates, or back up a little bit farther into a real recession, that goal of having a portfolio that we didn't have to worry about dropping by more than 10% along the way, the result wasn't even close. What we really saw is that portfolio, in many cases, still dropped 20% or more. And the danger for a lot of people is simply blindly trusting, what AI puts out without any way to verify it. Now, being in the profession, sure, I've got tools to verify it. Many of y'all could go into Morningstar or other tools online and check particular funds, but checking an entire portfolio becomes a little bit more difficult. So as we look at it and say there's certain things that AI is really good at, and I'm not naive enough to say, well, do I think AI is ever going to be able to pick a portfolio? Absolutely. I think they probably will, and they'll probably do a pretty good job on it. But based on your goals or your expectations, maybe they're not quite there, yet. But that brings up a few things that we need to talk about. So whether it's AI or whether it's a lot of what we're seeing today too, lots of advertisements on, portfolios, strategies, subscribe to our newsletter, this and that we see on social media and just online. Says a lot of them take, specific segments. You may have seen the advertisement say, well, look, our AI strategy has done this, come blowing away the S&P 500. Or look, our top 4 stock picks have had, 1,000% returns compared to only, 80% from the S&P. The issue with a lot of that kind of advertising, however, is one, most are not actual RIAs or registered investment advisors, meaning they're not responsible for the picks, if you will. They're not upheld to certain advertising standards. And in the fast-paced world of social media and advertising today, many of the advertisements we see probably do not comply at all with what the SEC would consider fair advertising. But things change so fast, the government isn't on top of every service that advertises out there. And in the old days, we can consider this, this was the old newsletter, saying, well, subscribe to our newsletter, we'll share our stock picks. They've just evolved to doing it on social media instead. The issue with that kind of advertising, though, is they'll share the top 4 picks. And those top 4 picks will be fantastic. However, they're under no obligation and many times either don't disclose at all or it's buried in 5 layers of fine print. Well, here's what our other 30 or 40 picks did. Not nearly as good as the top 4, and if you actually bought them as a portfolio, maybe didn't actually even do as well as the S&P 500, or certainly didn't smash it, as they did before. And what's the issue with that disclosure? Well, pull out your iPhone, pull out your Android, and it says every time there's an update and it says you agree, I'm sure you've read all 50 pages of what you agreed to, right? Same thing here is they may advertise by showing you the 4 or 5 home run stock. And yes, to meet disclosure rules, they may say, well, here's the list of all our stock, but it's buried 20 or 30 pages deep. So most people don't ever actually see it. So it kind of brings us back to that old buyer beware scenario that if you're simply investing or following advice from somebody who is either not responsible, not regulated, or has no obligation to share with you the full story, unfortunately, it's sort of the Wild West, if you will. So make sure that you're making good investment advice with full information. So when we look and see, well, where do we see, AI making an impact, in the investment space? It says, one, we can look at it as speed to the decision-making process. There are certain strategies, whether it's ETFs or stocks or options or even mutual funds, where those funds were what they would call tactical funds or even long-short funds. Based on information of how the market's behaving, they would either own different segments of the market or they would actually short or back out of the market and get more defensive. And in the days past, back up a decade or more, and it said those kind of funds had to get enough input from various economic sources, what they're seeing in the market, what they're getting out of government resources, and saying, okay, we have enough information to make a decision about what we should do with our investment strategy. That's the part that's really sped up. And so those decisions that maybe used to be measured in a quarter or two, and then 4 or 5 years ago maybe they were measured in a month or two, today we're seeing those kind of decisions in terms of making tactical shifts in a portfolio made in a matter of days or weeks instead, because of the access to data and the computing power of trying to sort of predict what that data is going to show. So that's one area we are seeing some big strides where AI is coming into the financial industry and putting it in place into funds or ETFs that normal consumers, normal people can access without having to do something that's either based on sort of partial truth or not, full disclosure. Again, as I said, ultimately, I think, AI and the pace of technology is speeding up faster and faster. So ultimately, we probably will get to the point where AI can produce a good portfolio based on the criteria that's fed into it, either return, income, or risk. We're just not quite there yet. But I also want to point out, even Vanguard has done a study that says, where do advisors actually add value? If the main value is not simply coming from the asset allocation, it's usually coming more from the behavioral side of things, making sure that people have a strategy, a good plan in place, and stick to that strategy, even when things in the market or in the economy can be a little uncertain. The other big area where advisors can add value is on the actual distribution, which types of accounts to take at which time in order to make sure that the money lasts or that the plan works, and also adding value on the tax side of things, making sure things are tax efficient when it comes to either distributions or overall planning. So when we look at all the areas where an advisor can add value, while today simply selecting of funds or selecting the allocation as a part of it, that's also the part that will likely be taken over by AI in the not too distant future. So as we look at it today, it's simply a little bit of buyer beware. While AI has some great uses and leads to a lot of efficiency, simply relying on AI to go pick your portfolio for you may be setting yourself up for disappointment, because if you don't have a means to check both not just the return but also the risk, how do you know you actually got what you were asking AI to give you? So I hope today's video was helpful. If you have some thoughts or want to share with us, drop a comment below. Thank you again for joining us. This is Michael Neuenschwander with Outlook Wealth Advisors.